Thank you, and hello and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to present my findings here. I think some of you might have heard of it, that there are elections going on in Brazil at the beginning of October, and to me, the candidate on the right, Bolsonaro, who we all know and few of us love, I hope, to me embodies what can be called political presentism or myopia, which is the general idea that, as Warren Buffett put it, when politicians have to choose between the next election and the next generation, it's clear what usually happens. So, well, what does happen is someone promises that they are going to boost the economy by cutting down forests, for example, which does make sense for current generations, but not for future generations. And future generations do not have a voice often in politics. And so we can see what happens, for example, in Brazil, but also in other parts of the world. So I was particularly interested in what it is about the political process that causes this myopia, because we don't necessarily see this in every other area and every other subsystem, but we see it in politics. So what is the nature of this problem and what are the causes? That was one of my research questions. And then, of course, we're interested in what could we do to actually do better than that. And so one attempt that has been tested and something that people have suggested is, well, we could include these future generations. And there are many ways that you can do this, and I've looked at some of those. And of course, it is very interesting to us, how do they differ from each other and which ones are actually working? And that's why I put best and worst practice examples into the title, because some are promising and others not so much, as you'll see. And so, of course, we're interested in the question, what can we learn from them? Because if we know better what works and what doesn't, that might help us to have better institutions in the future. I did this with help from Andrew Lay from Australia, economics professor and also member of parliament there, who also wrote a book on extreme politics and existential risk and the relationship between the two, which I can highly recommend. And then Matt Boyd from New Zealand. It was not intentionally that it was like the other side of the world, just kind of happened. But yeah, those were my two mentors. I've also had a couple of advisors who were helpful. So Jan Willem van Putten from Training for Good, who I've worked on a similar project with recently. Jonathan Boston in the middle here, who has published a lot on this kind of topic. Sam Hilton from the UK, who was also heading the all-party parliamentary group for future generations, together with Caroline Biden. And then this is Mr. Saijo from Japan, who has also looked at future design. So like, how can we design systems that are future-proof, so to speak? Let's look at the problem first. Why is it a problem and what causes it? So I will use the term myopia and political presentism as being synonymous here. Of course, there are small differences, but I'm not going to go into that. One reason, of course, we have elections, and those are a main driver and an incentive for short-termist behavior. Because, as we've said previously, future generations do not have a voice in these elections. Currently, they don't. And of course, if I can promise economic returns by sacrificing the future, and this might be popular with some people in the populations, then I could just do that, and I wouldn't necessarily be punished for it. Also, if I'm a politician and I do make long-term promises, the public is often less likely to trust me on these, because politicians do not have a good track record with that. So even if I'm being genuine there, that might not be something that would be a good tactic or strategy for me as a politician. Some people have called this also the presentist bias. So future generations do not have a voice. Our democratic systems are not set up to give them a voice. That's for a good reason also. We'll look into that. And so this is a quote by Al Gore, who said, the future whispers while the present shouts. And if I'm a politician and I'm basically listening to what the public is saying, then I will likely only hear the people who are shouting. Also, of course, there's discounting going on. Now, I think many people in EA are probably not that convinced that we should be discounting at the rates that we are, but we are. And as long as we are, then future generations are probably not going to play that big of a role. We also have external actors, so mainly big companies, not always in a bad way, sometimes in a good way, but they're also influencing policy. And since we also don't have future companies yet, the only companies that are currently influencing things are the ones who stand to benefit from something now, or maybe in the lifetime of their owner, if it's like more long-termist, but it's not really long-termist as we see it. And then finally, of course, the media acts as an accelerator for this presentist bias. Now on to some good news. So my first step was to look at, well, what are we actually currently doing? And you can see here a world map, and in light red, sorry, you can see the countries that actually mention future generations in their constitution. Now, talk is cheap, and clearly they're not really respecting future generations in many cases, but at least it is embedded in their constitution. And the number of countries, that is not going to surprise you, is rising. The Legal Priorities Project has done very great research with this kind of topic, and they've published a report. So if you're interested in that, either reach out to me, or you can also find it when you Google it. Now, what I added is the dark red colors, and those are countries that have implemented, tried, and tested measures that are designed to consider future generations. And you can see here it's a few, it's not a lot, but maybe something that could give us hope. The next step was then to compare these institutions, because, like I said, we want to know what works and what doesn't. And so what you can see here looks pretty complicated. I've tried using colors to make it more understandable for a short presentation. On the left-hand side, we can see the countries that have these types of institutions. So that's Finland, Hungary, or have had them in the past for like a certain period of time. Hungary, Israel, Scotland, Singapore, the United Kingdom, Wales, New Zealand, and Malta. I used a pretty narrow inclusion criteria. You could also include other countries, but I only used the ones that had something like an ombudsman for future generations or a commissioner for future generations. And then I scored them on a set of criteria to sort of identify what works and what didn't. One very interesting outlier is Israel that I want to mention here. So they have a very low score because the commissioner only lasted one term. Interestingly enough, they had a lot of power, which in my scoring system gives them a green. But then, of course, that triggered some backlash. And so this is one lesson that we might be able to learn. More power for such an institution is not necessarily a good thing. And then I also looked at the average numbers. So it seems that these institutions are often very good when it comes to the time horizon. So they often consider many generations into the future and not just the next 10 years. But they're generally rather weak. So that's a pretty low score for power. And we also have a pretty low score for longevity. So some of these institutions didn't even last very long, and some were not received very well within the public. I could go into detail here, but I do not have the time. So we're going to move on to the most promising candidate, which was Wales. Now, Wales introduced a Future Generations Commissioner. And in this study that I did, or in those findings, suggest that Wales came out on top for many of these criteria. And so it was particularly interesting to look at. And what I wanted to do when I was looking at it was not just look at these criteria, but also look at the questions that we do care about. So we care about the question whether Wales was able, through this institution, to solve problems of political presentism. And so there's a list of questions that I came up by reviewing the literature. And so we're curious whether there are mechanisms to overcome presentism, of course, but also, is there a mechanism to actually represent future generations, or is it just like someone who watches out for them, but they don't actually have a vote for the future generation? We care about whether there's long-term compliance, or it's just for a while. We care about whether we can get cross-party agreement on something. We care about whether it increases political trust, so that kind of thing. And for Wales, it looks like, yes, somehow it's helping with a few things. For other things, you can clearly say no. And for other things, you can say it's complicated. I'm probably going to publish the results of this as a paper, but also upload it to the Google Drive folder. So you can look into the detailed analysis if this looks like something you might be interested in. I also want to, towards the end of this, talk about uncertainties and limitations, because it might have been that I made it seem that we just need institutions for future generations, and it's just going to be great once we have them, and they just need to be good, and we need to do what Wales is doing. And I think there's quite a few reasons why we may want to be careful. So there's a couple of questions, and this is also an area where we might just need more research. And I'd like to encourage people who listen to this, find this interesting, to look into it. The first question is, who do we actually represent? So in a democracy, we have to make that decision, but clearly we can't make it in proportion to the amount of people who will exist in the future. So that's the first problem. We don't know what their interests are going to be. It's very difficult to predict. And what do we do if their interests compete with ours? How do we make that trade-off? There's also a risk of politicizing the issue. That has happened in Wales. So some people have said she's wasting money because she has ties to X party. And so that's a problem. Also, these institutions have grown in very distinct political cultures, and it might be difficult to transfer them to, let's say, the United States, China, other actors that might have more power. And generally, it's very difficult to have these feedback loops because we don't know yet whether there's long-term compliance with what the Future Generations Commissioner is recommending us to do. Also, some people have said maybe we shouldn't just dive into politics at all because that space is very difficult to change, or it doesn't change at all. And maybe particularly for EA people, we shouldn't be doing this because there's reputational risk associated with it. And then also you might be asking, why do we care what Malta and Wales do? They're not very likely to be the reason why we go extinct. That's one thing. Finally, maybe there's hope on the horizon. Looking to Brazil again. Bolsonaro at the moment is not leading the polls, so maybe we are not as short-termist as I have portrayed us to be in the beginning. Finally, what's next for me? So I'm hoping to get this published. I'm also a finalist for Clearer Thinking Regrant, and hope to launch a program with that. So if you're interested in that, I might be looking for other people to work with me on this. And since I'm running out of time, I'm just going to go straight to this. If you have any feedback on what I just told you about, or you're saying, hey, you've clearly missed something, or I'd like to get in touch, then there's a QR code. You can leave your email address. You can leave some feedback for me. I'll quickly show the last slide, but then I'll go back to this one in case people want to make use of that. Thank you for your time, and I'm excited to hear about your questions.
Okay, thanks for that presentation, Moritz. We do have some questions immediately. So over to Nathaniel.
Hi, how much in your view do these issues with democratic myopia apply outside of like particular sort of parliamentary or representative democracies? And I'm thinking, you know, like neighborhood assemblies, sortition systems, that kind of thing.
Oh, great question. A question I wish I had considered earlier. Yeah, no, I think that is a good question. I think some of these problems. So as you remember, there was this list. I could go back to it. So I identified different problems, right? And then I was asking, is this mechanism able to overcome this problem? And so I think for some of these problems, yes, other systems don't have them. So let's say you don't have an electoral cycle of 4 or 5 years, but it's 20 or 30 years. Now that comes with its own problems, but suddenly you don't have this pandering every 4 or 5 years. And so that overcomes the problem of the short electoral term. But then it probably still has some of the other issues. So I think for each system, you would have some of these problems. And for some systems, some would be more pronounced than others. That would be my guess, but I haven't looked into other systems that much.
Thanks, Moritz. Next question.
How do you address issues where there's a misalignment between perhaps, I guess, different people's future generations? Like, I don't know if this would exactly apply in the case of Brazil, but you could sort of think of this with respect to global warming in terms of it being a big prisoner's dilemma. And there's some like short-term economic motivations a country could have that actually would help them in isolation over the long term, regardless of what happens in terms of global warming. It's bad for everyone else. You just have this big structural prisoner's dilemma. Like, how do you reason about that? Like, is it the democracy is representing like other countries' future interests as well, or just their own citizens? Because I could see room for misalignment there.
Yeah, Well, there are many things to that question. So first of all, I think we should have some hope as far as overcoming prisoners' dilemma is in international relations, because we've done so in other areas. So I think there's room for hope there. And then maybe going to the international part of that question, the United Nations have actually called for modeling something like so they had the special envoy for future generations, and they wanted to model their international version of that based on the approach that was tested in Wales. And so maybe as small as Wales is, that has provided an example for international institutions. And I think at the moment we just don't have that much knowledge about it. So it might just be a matter of getting more of these experiments tested in different countries and then being able to see if they can solve these problems on a national level and then take it international.
Thanks. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Som was the next person to put his hand up, so here.
Hello. So
Hi.
I have a question towards about the bit at the end of your presentation. So in particular, in your opinion, if you had to design or say what would make a future generations commissioner or some other kind of institution sort of go well, what would sort of make it go well, basically? And I think I'm like okay with sort of a lower epistemic sort of status on this, but I really do want to like get concrete sort of hot takes.
Yeah. I don't know if you'll get hot takes in, like from somebody who's doing this value for the research and like for learning about this. But I think there's definitely a few things that I can say with like almost certainty. So we can see that like too much power definitely is not a good thing. I think one thing that's very contentious is the budget. So if they don't have enough money, they can't really do their work properly, right? And they often don't. At the same time, what happened in Israel is they didn't even have that much money, but one of the reasons that they didn't make it through to the second term is people said, oh, they're wasting our money. So there's something about public reception that seems to be very, very important. I think politicization, am I pronouncing that correctly? That is a problem. And so you want to establish a future generations commissioner that is sort of like outside of that political framework. And then some people have actually called for citizens' involvement. So like you could be electing one. I'm not very sympathetic to that view because you will then have pandering again. Like you will have people voting for a future generations commissioner who more likely than not are short-termist or like have that myopic vision. And so there's some problem with that, but at the same time, they need to have democratic legitimacy. So I think that's something that we will be thinking and talking about a lot in the future, how to square these problems.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Moritz. That's all we have time for. So let's have a final round of applause for Moritz.